The Nintendo 64 library is filled to the brim with top-tier video games. Mario games, Zelda games, Smash, GoldenEye, Banjo-Kazooie. We could sit here all day just listing great games on that console. And while the value of these games has steadily gone up, especially in recent years, many of these games are still relatively affordable. You might buy a used 64 game for the cost of a brand new Switch game, for example. But there are some holy grails for N64 collectors that get a bit higher, games that hit the $100 to several $100 price tags for one reason or another. But there is a single game that leads the pack on the N64.
This is the rarest N64 game of all time, ClayFighter Sculptor's Cut. Well, this isn't the real thing. I'm not about to sell a kidney and one of my earlobes for the real N64 cartridge. This is a reproduction. There are other rarer games out there, but these were like demo or kiosk cartridges that were sent to stores specifically for display purposes. So they're going to be rarer because there just weren't as many. This is the only game that the public was supposed to get their hands on.
But to get the full idea of why this game is so valuable, we need to go back to the first entry in the series 5 years prior on the Super NES. This is the story of the ClayFighter series. In 1991, Capcom released Street Fighter II: The World Warrior, not knowing the massive impact on gaming it would soon have. Not only did it bring a resurgence to the arcade gaming scene, but it brought along a resurgence of the fighting game genre as a whole. It also shifted the focus of arcade gaming away from the concept of high scores, an idea that was already beginning to die out on home consoles, and it instead focused on the head-to-head competition between two players. The unbelievable popularity of Street Fighter II raised many eyebrows, and quickly other companies wanted to capitalize on the fighting game genre with their own takes. Mortal Kombat, Art of Fighting, Killer Instinct, all these games essentially have Street Fighter II as a part of their conceptual DNA. But the fighting game genre didn't surge without its speed bumps, and a big one was right around the corner: the concern about violence in video games. During the early 90s, this was a huge deal. Previously, the game publishers themselves would be the governing body on what was appropriate and what wasn't, which resulted in standards that differed company to company. The best example of this is the home console versions of Mortal Kombat. On the arcade versions, the game could get pretty violent, with blood spraying when characters are injured, and of course the infamous fatalities, which featured things like exploding heads or ripped out spinal cords. The home versions of these games were censored to remove blood and make the fatalities more generic finishing moves in an attempt to appeal to a broader audience. But the argument about violence in video games as a whole resulted in multiple now famous US Senate hearings discussing the topic, and ultimately brought us the ESRB and the rating system that we still use to this very day. So all of that is to say that violence in video games was a hotly contested topic at the time, and as these things do, it sparked an idea in Greg Thomas, the president of game studio Visual Concepts. Quote, "Everybody is so serious with Mortal Kombat and Street Fighter. We wanted to add something new to the genre and make it funny. In other words, let's make a fighting game, but without the overt violence, which admittedly is pretty smart. There were definitely lots of parents holding off on more violent video games, so here's the ideal game for both them and for their kids." And so, development began on a new fighting game titled ClayFighter, which was ultimately completed as a humorous parody of Street Fighter. The plot of the game is fairly simple. A clay meteor rockets to Earth from outer space and ends up crashing at a circus. But this clay wasn't just any clay, this was space clay! And so it attaches itself to a bunch of the attractions at the circus and makes them weird living versions of themselves. You've got characters like Taffy, a sentient piece of saltwater taffy, Bonker, naturally a clown who fights with what you'd expect a clown to fight with, Blue Suede Goo, an Elvis impersonator with all sorts of funny references, and the main character of the game, Bad Mr. Frosty, an evil snowman. Not only is clay the main inspiration for the game's plot, it was the main source of the game's design. Every single character in the game was physically crafted with all sorts of different modeling clay and manipulated into different positions for all of the moves that they would use. They would then take photos of these different positions and animate them using stop motion in order to guide how the characters should move. The photographs of these fighters were then converted into sprites that were usable on both the SNES and Sega Genesis. This process was actually quite similar to Mortal Kombat's development, except instead of using clay models, Mortal Kombat opted for humans against a blue screen who were then converted into sprite form. This process was said to be incredibly long and tedious, but I honestly commend them for actually going all the way with the clay theme. Unfortunately, I think the limitations of 16-bit consoles really didn't let this concept shine. Now, there's no doubt that these sprites look fantastic. They remind me of how advanced the sprites in Donkey Kong Country looked, which were 3D models converted to 2D sprites. The problem is you just don't really get the idea of clay just by looking at them. Even the character who is literally just a blob of clay doesn't really look like clay, purely based on the sprite work. And that's not a dig on the developers, just to be clear. They literally made clay models. They did everything they could. You just can't get around a console's graphical limitations sometimes. Does this look like a really cool sprite of a snowman? Absolutely. But does it look like a clay snowman? Not so much. And again, the goal of this game was to create a family-friendly sort of fighting game, without any of the blood or typical violence, but still with the heated gamer energy that a fighting game can bring. But despite the design philosophy, this is a fighting game. There's attacking, comboing, blocking, and speaking of blocking, don't you want to block malware and foreign hackers? NordVPN is the industry standard VPN that gives you the peace of mind you want while browsing the web. From threat protection on suspicious ads to advanced malware tech, you know you're getting the best security out there. And not only that, it's perfect for gaming and entertainment. I personally used it to watch the final season of Better Call Saul on Netflix instead of live TV. I mean, I don't even have cable. I just switched my region from the US to the UK and bam! Brand new episodes at my fingertips. And if you head to nordvpn.com/Aaronitmar, you'll get a huge discount off the 2-year plan with 4 additional months completely free. And you can try NordVPN risk-free thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. So what are you waiting for? Block malicious ads and trackers easier than a snowball by going to nordvpn.com/Aaronitmar. ClayFighter released in North America on November 15th, 1993. And interestingly, just 6 months later, they released an updated version of the game, ClayFighter Tournament Edition. Releasing revised versions of fighting games wasn't exactly outside of the norm. By ClayFighter's initial release, Street Fighter II had already seen 4 unique versions of the game out. These updated versions of the game were done for a variety of reasons, patching out glitches, adding characters, balancing the game, and other minor tweaks. I mean, it's not like they had the ability to send out a patch over the internet, so a full new physical release was the next best thing. But ClayFighter Tournament Edition was a bit of an oddball for several reasons. First, it made only a single balance change, nerfing one of Bad Mr. Frosty's moves. Outside of that, it was mostly just an opportunity for them to fix a number of glitches from the original game. It also added some new palettes, difficulty and speed options, new versus modes, and of course a tournament mode. The other odd thing is that this game wasn't widely available. Interplay made a deal with the video rental store Blockbuster to make Tournament Edition a rental-only exclusive deal for the store. This severely reduced the number of people who would have played this version of the game, so all in all, it probably was for the best that this update to the game didn't really change too much mechanically. Owners of the original ClayFighter were probably cool to just keep playing their version of the game. They weren't really missing out on much. But soon, development on a true sequel game would begin. This new game was fully developed in-house by Interplay, and it improved upon ClayFighter 1 by retiring what director Jeremy Airy referred to as a primitive engine, instead relying on new processing and scripting tools. Whereas ClayFighter 1 took a year to develop, both the programs created and the sequel game itself were developed in only 6 months. ClayFighter 2 Judgment Clay released exclusively for the SNES on New Year's Day 1995 in North America and May 23rd that same year in Europe. The game's subtitle is a reference to Terminator 2 Judgment Day, with some of the designs and logos being direct parodies of T2. Unfortunately, much of the game's design seemed to be a step back from the solid base that ClayFighter 1 was. On the character design side, Airy was quite disappointed with the quality of the clay models, calling them horrendous and total crap, which Airy blames on the different company they hired to create the models this time around. Additionally, the game seems to do an about-face on what helped them stand apart from the other fighting games on the scene. Whereas ClayFighter was bright, colorful, and silly, ClayFighter 2 had much darker and serious tones, which directly clashes with the goofy, playable characters in the game. On top of that, many of the characters from the first ClayFighter don't even return. In fact, only 3 characters, Bad Mr. Frosty, Tiny, and Blob, make a return in the sequel. The remaining 5 characters are completely original. So you go from ClayFighter 1 with its roster of 8 characters, get 5 completely new characters in ClayFighter 2, and you still only end up with a roster of 8 characters. Ultimately, ClayFighter 2 was a rather forgettable sequel in the series, but it apparently did just well enough to warrant another entry just a couple of years later. In late 1995, ClayFighter 3 was announced as an upcoming game for the Panasonic M2, a game console developed by the 3DO company. It was one of only 4 games announced at the time, indicating that this was supposed to be one of the games meant to attract players to this new console. The M2 actually made it pretty far along in development, but not wanting to compete with the PlayStation and Nintendo 64, the project was ultimately canned. The writing seemed to have been on the wall though, as ahead of the M2's cancellation, Interplay had already shifted focus away from the M2 for ClayFighter 3 and instead focused on the N64 and PlayStation. The original company hired for the clay models for ClayFighter 1 were brought back on board, and again the stop motion process was used for this third entry. But the big advantage this time is that the graphic and color capabilities of these later consoles finally let this method shine. The character sprites for this game genuinely look like they are made out of clay, rather than just, really solid looking sprites. Additionally, the power of these new consoles allowed for 3D environments to serve as the stages, since the sprite-based fighters weren't exactly that resource intensive. The development of the PlayStation version was also canned, leaving just the game for the N64. This was because the PlayStation version was behind schedule, and would ultimately release later than the 64 version, and there were concerns internally that it would be viewed simply as a PlayStation port rather than built specifically for the hardware. But finally, on October 23rd, 1997, ClayFighter 63 and a third released for the N64. Keeping to its roots, the game's title is a parody, this time around of the tendency to slap 64 on the end of games that were made for the N64. So instead, they went with 63 and a third just to be funny. But the parody does not stop there, because this game pulls aspects from every major fighting game out at the time. From Street Fighter, you have a parry system as well as a combo meter that allows for the use of super moves by burning 1 or 3 bars. Even some of the super moves are copycats from Street Fighter. From Killer Instinct, they have a similar combo system, as well as the concept of insane combos, finishing moves similar to ultra combos that do a massive amount of hits on an enemy with low health. And for Mortal Kombat, ClayFighter finally brought on an idea that they wanted to in previous entries, copying fatalities. In this game, they're known as claytalities, and are finishing moves done after you have defeated an opponent, though more comical than strictly gory and violent as in Mortal Kombat. Here's the problem though. Incorporating all of these into a single game sounds cool conceptually. The problem is, it feels like ClayFighter 63 and a third doesn't have its own identity. Now yeah, it's a parody of other fighting games, but even parodies build their own identity while also making fun of their source material. This game just feels like a stiff punch and kick simulator that exists just for the player to activate the various parody moves. And this series was always intended to have the longevity of a Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, something that you could regularly pick up, enter tournaments, get competitive with your friends. But its biggest draws are just not enough. The parody moves are cool, and the game is certainly funny, outside of the poorly aged, stereotypical characters, but those things can only take you so far. After 200 hours of playtime, the humor of the game isn't going to be funny anymore, so the gameplay really needs to carry the game, and unfortunately, this just doesn't do it. It's fun to play for an hour or two, or when you've got a bunch of friends over, but after that, you kinda just wanna go boot up another fighting game or pull out Mario Kart or something. The developers also made some really strange choices with regards to giving players all of the information. There's no way to look up a character's combos, for example. There's nothing defined in the game's menus, and even the manual just kind of gives a vague description of each type of move without explaining how to do them. The developers would also talk in interviews about their satisfaction of finally getting to include claytalities, but in the manual, it literally just says, try to figure it out. It gives you absolutely zero information. Other fighting games give you all the information somewhere, because the goal of the game is to use all of your abilities to defeat your opponent. It's like this game simultaneously wanted to be a good fighting game and also not at all at the same time. There are also 3 secret characters in the game that you can't unlock through normal gameplay. You have to enter in a cheat code for each character through a button combination on the character select screen, which will then unlock that character, but only for the duration that the game is powered on. You have to repeat this cheat code each and every time you boot up the game. And again, they don't give you this information. In 1997, you either had to be lucky to have internet access and look it up, or get one of those massive cheat code books from the book fair or something. But I'll also give them credit where it's due. One really cool thing about the game is that it introduces guest characters. Both Earthworm Jim and Booger Man were games created by Interplay, and both of these characters are playable fighters, which is admittedly pretty cool. There's also a mysterious scrapped character by the name of Hobo Cop, who was intended for inclusion in the game before Nintendo stated that they would rather him be removed. Hobo Cop still has his data in the game and would apparently fight with alcohol and in some cases his genitals. Yeah, I see why Nintendo would put a stop to that. Just 7 months after ClayFighter 63 1/3's release, a new special edition of the game was released. ClayFighter Sculptor's Cut, a play on director's cuts for movies, but with their clay sculpting twist. This version of the game is basically like Tournament Edition for the first game, an updated version of the original that offers tweaks and balance changes. Unlike Tournament Edition, this version of the game had much more significant changes. For starters, the Killer Instinct style combo system was removed, along with insane combos and combo breakers. Some claytalities were removed and others were adjusted or updated, and many special moves were totally removed for characters. Other smaller changes were made as well, including an improved menu, the removal of 3D scrolling to make breaking through the other rooms easier, and some new voice clips and stages. They also rearranged some of the characters so that secret characters in 63 1/3 are now base roster and vice versa, which is kinda weird, and they didn't even fix the unlockable cheat code character thing, it's still there. On top of this, there are 4 brand new characters added to the game. These characters were actually meant to be in the original release of the game, but they were removed as a result of time and data constraints. But what makes Sculptor's Cut so valuable and rare? On the surface, it looks like any other game update. Well, just like with Tournament Edition, Interplay worked out a deal with Blockbuster to offer Sculptor's Cut as a rental-only exclusive to their franchise. Only 20,000 copies of the game were manufactured for the deal, and moreover, the game wasn't available to straight-up purchase, it was a rental only. There are stories of some people swapping their 63 1/3 copy for Sculptor's Cut back in the day, and ultimately copies did end up leaving stores through dumpster diving or inventory sales. And we're just talking about the cartridge here. The box and manual are infinitely more valuable, as with most older games, but especially in this case. Think about the number of hands that would touch a rental box, the number of snotty fingers or juice spills or dogs tearing it up. The odds of the box surviving in decent condition, or at all, is really low, which is why the value of the box and manual is proportionally so much higher than for other games. So all of this, low production numbers, unable to actually purchase it, the poor condition many copies were in, these combined factors make ClayFighter Sculptor's Cut the insane collector's item it is today, despite the game being pretty mid overall. And that was the end of the ClayFighter series. A couple of games were announced in both 2009 and 2016, but nothing ever came of either of these announcements. But all hope for ClayFighter fans is not lost. This series certainly has a very small but active following, and multiple projects have come out of this. The first is Ultra ClayFighter. In the same vein as Street Fighter updates, this is a fan project that aims to rework the game into something far superior. Existing moves and specials are updated, and there are even new special moves, a juggle system, and all sorts of optimizations that make this much more enjoyable to play than vanilla ClayFighter. The other big project is a rather recently announced one, ClayFighter Resculpted. This one isn't a mod, it's instead a fan game looking to bring some revival to this long-lost franchise. The project aims to bring back pretty much all of the characters into a single roster, and even bring in some brand new ones that were never in ClayFighter before. Links to both of these fantastic fan projects will be in the description. I highly recommend them if you are all interested in this series. And that is the messy story of ClayFighter, which ultimately brought us the rarest N64 game of all time. It really is a shame this series seemed to have been fumbled all its life, because on paper it sounds like a brilliant idea, a funny parody of other fighting games while itself being a good fighting game that you could play competitively. Unfortunately, each game had something that missed the mark, and ultimately it's no surprise that the franchise hasn't been touched in years. That's it for this video. Thank you guys all for watching, and a big thanks to NordVPN for sponsoring today's video. Peace out, you guys, and please remember to be good to one another.